Hey everyone, it's Sleepy Reader Damien back for part two of my confessions, my eighth anniversary video. It was exactly 8 years ago today, probably this time of night, that I first posted a video on the Sleepy Reader channel, and my very first video on YouTube, my very first public talking about comics. And anyway, I really appreciate all the people who have me questions. And the first one to do so was Eric at Longbox Review. And he, on Twitter, I was kind of pondering, well, what am I going to do for my 8th anniversary? And he sent me these questions. And that made me decide, yeah, I'll do one of these Q&As. And somewhere along the way, I decided to throw in a few confessions of a longtime YouTuber, a longtime comic book guy. So anyway, he gave me a bunch of questions, and they were, on target for the fact that this is YouTube and it's my 8th anniversary. He first asked, "What have you learned after 8 years of being?" I have learned that public speaking is easier than I thought. I've learned that you can get used to a lot of things, like looking at yourself and talking to and imagining an audience out there. And I have learned that you can get a lot out of doing a vlog, a diary, a journal, because that's basically what this has been in a way. And there's a lot more sort of hard to put your finger on things that you get out of it over time. Then he asked, what's changed in comics or the YouTube comic community during that time? And both, I think, have changed incrementally over those years. Comic books seem to have a blossoming, as seems to happen every now and then, of the independent comics, and maybe a decline in the quality of DC and Marvel, but it's hard to say if that's really true or not. But it kind of feels like that way to me, like maybe they're a bit overtaken by their corporate culture, and their chasing of the marketplace led them in some bad directions, maybe. Again, hard to say. It wasn't always like that. My perception was that in the early part of the first decade of the 2000s, that there was kind of a steady growth in comics, and then they've kind of floundered around in this second decade after a while in terms of the big two. But I could be totally wrong on that, because they certainly floundered around in the 90s, particularly after the boom ended. So that's one perception of a change, and basically this booming of the indies. I fear that there's going to be a crash of indies, not only because that's happened historically a number of times before, but also because of this epidemic, that smaller companies are just going to go away. New small companies will come back eventually, but we're going to see some falling away. We're going to see some creators who don't end up coming back, I would bet, some unfinished series and the like. In terms of the changes in the comic book community, it's grown a lot. And as it's grown, it's seen different trends, different types of collectors come in. Each generation is influenced by what they saw recently and want to emulate. I had a certain group of people that I liked what they were doing, and they were pretty much, this very small little community, and I came in and I wanted to do the same thing. But I felt like part of what they were doing is each person was expressing their own experiences in separate different ways. So I have found, going back to the first question, I found that a lot of what I got out of the 8 years was that expressing of myself in my own individual way. It seems like sometimes in the waves of new YouTubers, there'll be a bunch of people who are imitating what they think is the way to do things. Although I think those people don't last very long, and the people who last longer are doing their own thing. Sadly, a bunch of people who are doing their own thing kind of come and go also. Maybe because they don't find enough of an audience to feel some satisfaction in doing it, or some other thing happens in their lives. There's always a million different reasons. I feel a lot of nostalgia and sadness as I look back at the people who I used to chat with who are just gone. I kind of felt that when I was at the beginning of the first video in this series, when I was running down the list of names that I wrote in my first video, because I think only one or two of them is still active. And many of them, I just don't know what happened or what they felt like. I noticed there's an inevitable, well, it seems inevitable for most of us. Most of us, we might be towards the center of the community for a while, and then we move out towards the fringes, maybe have a bit less viewers, whatever our subscriber numbers happen to be. And then ultimately, with the larger community, I think it becomes like that elephant, with the blind men feeling the different parts of the elephant and having a different impression of what kind of creature it is. So the comic book community now is a different thing to different people. And you kind of run into that sometimes, and it's kind of a strange experience when you realize someone's talking about the comic book community, and everybody they're in touch with are people that you've never heard of before, even though you used to feel like you knew everyone in the comic book community. What do you wish you knew when you started? Well, it's one of those funny things that I don't know if any advice I could give myself in the past would be worth taking, or like I'd have to live through it. But I guess I would say that, some of the people that you come into contact with are going to turn out to be different than what you thought they were. And even though we have this protective buffer of the internet, it can feel like an emotional buffeting at times when relationships go sour, or people that you were friends with, both of them now hate each other, and you feel stuck in the middle, or that sort of thing. It's a weird funhouse version of real life, I guess. There's also a lot more opportunity to talk behind people's back when you're on the internet. What advice do you have for newer comic book YouTubers? So one is, if you're going to spend any money in equipment, get a good microphone. I think that's the most important thing to be heard. Two is just make videos when you want to. Don't put pressure on yourself, because that's going to lead to you quitting and having less fun. And think about what you title your videos. Titles have a large effect on how many viewers a video gets and what kind of viewers that video gets. Do you want the people who will be attracted to a certain title? I've thought about that at times. I discovered sort of by accident, I do this and I'll get a lot more views. And then some of those things that get more views I kind of avoid, because it's not getting me the audience or the interaction that I want. Another big thing, I don't see a lot of conflict in the parts of the YouTube community that I'm currently cognizant of, but there have been big conflicts that have come and gone in kind of waves over these 8 years. And so I would say, never make a video when you're angry. I made a few videos when I was angry, and I think I luckily deleted all of them before they really became live. But I've seen people make angry videos, and I've seen the bad results that happen there. And excuse me. Yeah, that's about it. Just telling newer YouTubers to, unless you really are trying to do a channel that's going to get a big audience and make money, just sit back, have fun, wait for the moments when you're in a good space, when you have enough energy to project a little bit. I don't know if I'm the greatest in the world at that, but occasionally I make a video where I'm just too mopey, and those are the bad videos. What are your plans for the next 8 years? First off, I never thought ahead, so I never imagined myself in 8 years in the first place, or in 2 years. And so now when you ask me, I suddenly feel like I should have plans. I guess I have a lot of vague plans of like individual things to do, and sometimes I wonder, again, because of the YouTube channel getting bigger, if I might change my approach eventually and, just maybe whittle down to a certain kind of video. I don't think I really will, but sometimes I think about like just doing videos that say feature a favorite comic book, each video like on a different favorite comic book or not. And I'd like to do some comics like that, some videos like that, or that follow a series of comics and are more, what would be the right word? All these videos are for my pleasure, but are not focused on communicating with the community, just putting out some of my thoughts on a comic book and leaving it at that. If the community, at some point, possibly the community will just totally disperse. Other hopes for my channel is to do even more social stuff. I have this weird mixed feeling about live hangouts just because they always tend to go long and they're really fun while you're doing them, but it doesn't seem like something very good to come back and watch later on. And maybe I'm wrong about that. So another hope for the future Longbox review, Eric, is to do more podcasts with you. Eric has a great podcast and kind of inspired me and Matt to make our podcast. And so anyway, more team ups would be great. So move on to the next set of questions. Longtime YouTuber, longtime online buddy, Clark Kent Jeans, also has gone by many other names previously. I don't know if he wants his real name mentioned anymore. He asks, who is on your Mount Rushmore of comic book artists? And that's a bit of a problem for me because there's supposed to be 4 people on Mount Rushmore, right? But I have a big 3 that's very clear to me. And whoops, I got some other ones in the way here. And that is maybe pretty obvious stuff. It's Jack Kirby. And because Mount Rushmore, to me, these are the formative major players of all time. So Jack Kirby, of course, and Mobius. Just have that. Maybe that's a bad example. Here's Mobius of the Incal fame and many other things. Most famous European artist amongst comic book fans, at least. I don't know if he's the most famous in Europe. I would assume Hergé or the makers of Asterix or something along that line, or maybe something I haven't even heard of. And then Will Eisner. So to me, those 3 are the definitive Mount Rushmore guys. They are formative building blocks that everyone else has built their comic book empire on in one way or another. And I love them. So I suppose if there was someone out there who everyone has built their comic book empire on that I don't love, I can't think of them. But then who would be in the number 4 place? And I don't really know. It occurred to me, but it's just, he's not my guy, but Milton Caniff, because I just haven't dug into enough Milton. He may be formative. I used to hear so many people talk about what an influence he was on all the early comic book artists, including Will Eisner and I presume Jack Kirby. Maybe not on Mobius, I don't know. But Caniff is definitely an influence also on some European artists. So he might fit from an intellectual point of view. Heavy books falling over and other things falling over, just to add to the falling. Speaking of heavy books, I kind of want to put Steve Ditko on that Mount Rushmore, but I think he has more, and he's a pretty influential artist, but I don't feel like he's as strongly foundational as the others, and he's more of a certain time and place, and his entire body of work hasn't had as big of an influence as just a few moments in his body of work. But to me, he was the first person that I thought of for that fourth place. And then I just have a bunch of emotional favorites that I think mostly tie in to my love of Marvel Comics in the 60s and 70s. So such as Gil Kane. I mean, I came very close to putting Gil Kane also. He's had a huge influence on superhero comics. I think many people who maybe don't even haven't even studied Gil Kane have been influenced by other people who've studied Gil Kane. There's not many pictures in here, but and he certainly was a huge shaper of comic books in my childhood and teen years and before. And then John Buscema, major shaper also of superhero comics for a long time, but I think he's of his era, very important person of his era, but maybe I don't know how big the influence is. And to some degree, he's very Kirby influenced, I guess because he was asked to be Kirby influenced, and very Hal Foster influenced. And then, I feel like Jim Steranko is very influential, but again, maybe because of my nostalgia time of when I started reading comics, Steranko's main comic run had ended, but it was something that everyone was looking back to, and it was those comic books I wished I could get at the time. And so I think he did a lot of important things. He's very Kirby influenced, very Eisner influenced himself, and brought in a lot of 1960s design elements, perhaps created some 1960s design elements. But so I'd love to put all these people and a few more on some really extended Mount Rushmore, such as Neil Adams. I think his influence on comic books from him onwards is huge, on American superhero comics, I should say. So he had a huge influence on styles that we still see at DC and Marvel Comics, especially DC Comics. And for a long time, you might have thought he was the most influential artist. There were so many artists whose starting point was kind of a pseudo Neil Adams style. And finally, one that gets a lot less notice, but I think was immensely influential and just a really great artist coming out of the 70s was Gene Colan. I know he had 60s work too, coming out of the 60s and 70s. And he was around in the 80s and into the 90s, but I think his big influential work was in the late 60s and in the 70s. So those are all... Sorry, I couldn't come up with 4 definitive ones, but I have 3 definitive people on there. And 64-page special, who in some new feature of YouTube says he has received amongst the most hearts from me of anyone ever. And that's probably because he is one of my greatest commenters. So I love his videos too, but you can't put hearts on other people's videos, right? Just thumbs up. So I have hearted so many comments by him that he is like the most loved person on my YouTube channel, apparently. His question is, does the name Sleepy Reader still apply to the channel? When Quacking Duck was a little one, keeping you up all night, every night, it was apt. But can it still be since you're well rested and alert? Yeah, I suppose there's an element of that. Back in the day, I was the one who could get along with less sleep than my wife, and my daughter was not a great sleeper. So I was up a lot, but although I could get along with less sleep, I was, very sleepy, and I can see it in my early videos. I'm still pretty sleepy. I still relate to that term. Partially because it seems like, I don't know if it's because I was an older father and then had this weird forced to wake up several times a night for a number of years. Then it feels like my body's gotten to that habit, or maybe it's just old age. So I still wake up a lot, and I still wish I was getting more sleep than I do. But I am much more well rested than I was beginning. But I love the name Sleepy Reader now. I kind of feel like it's me. I can as quickly or even more quickly, if I hear someone say the name Sleepy Reader on a YouTube video, I just feel like that's me. Speaking of great commenters, there is Max Washington Songs, and I love his channel. I think I've talked about how much I enjoy his music, and he's a big comic book fan, and sometimes he'll make videos that are a combination of comic books and music. And he asks a lot of questions. He asks, what are a few favorite science fiction movies? And off the top of my head, The Matrix, Brazil by Terry Gilliam, and 2001, and there's another big favorite. Now I'm blanking it. Favorite horror comic series, perhaps what I just showed, the Tomb of Dracula by Gene Colan and Marv Wolfman. That might be my favorite horror series, and or The Sixth Gun, perhaps. Did you read Superior Spider-Man? Thoughts, please. I loved it. Oh, you loved it. I enjoyed it. I was not a Spider-Man reader at the time, and I just sort of jumped on because I was curious. And then I jumped off. I was liking it, but I don't know what happened. I got distracted by other things. I think I found it I found it a weird experience to be focused on Dr. Octopus being Peter Parker, and it made me feel kind of squirrely and like I wanted to jump out of my skin while I was reading the comic in a way. But it seemed very good, and I've always meant to go back and read the whole run because I've heard a lot of good things about it. How about New 52 Resurrection Man? I was happily surprised. It's awesome. I never heard of it before that. I think the Resurrection Man had some other incarnation, but I hadn't read it before, but the name sounded familiar. But I did read it in the New 52, and I really enjoyed it a lot, and I was really sad when it got the axe. It's just kind of a fun concept, someone who keeps coming back to life. And I think every time he comes back to life, he has a different power set. So that was really cool. In fact, talking about it makes me want to go back and read it again and look and find out what his other appearances were. Did you enjoy the original Clone Saga at all? I never read the original Clone Saga. I think I heard about it, and the moment I heard about it, I felt like I didn't want to read it. But I was already kind of out of Spider-Man. I think the last Spider-Man I read until coming back to comics, it's probably not true. I probably picked up the occasional Spider-Man other times, but the main thing I remember is picking up, I had not been reading Spider-Man for a long time, and I picked up Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man #1, which he wrote and draw, and I was like, what is this? This art's kind of cool, but this is not the way I want Spider-Man, and I didn't buy any more then. And so I think the Clone Saga came after that, or did it come before that? I can't even remember. But I basically stopped reading Spider-Man shortly after the black costume arrived, maybe just as Venom made his first appearance or something. Somewhere around there I stopped. I think partially for economic reasons, but I was also kind of losing interest. Favorite Batman actor? You know what? I have liked them all at different times, except maybe Val Kilmer. No, I think at first I thought I liked Val Kilmer even. But now, as time rolls on, I think I keep coming back to Adam West, my first love. You know, before I ever even read a comic book, at least that I can remember, I saw Adam West playing Batman, and it made me love comic books and superheroes and all that goofy stuff. Favorite Darren on Bewitched? Oh, shoot. They're both named Dick. And is the second one Dick York? I liked the second one better. He seemed just a touch more cool. The first one with like fingernails on the chalkboard as a human being for some reason. So, another confession. I don't know how many comics are in my comic book collection. Now, my CLZ app tells me I have a little over 10,000, but I know that there's a lot that I never CLZ'd. I'm just not sure how many. So do I have 10,500? Do I have 12,000? Do I have 14,000? It's chaos in there. The last time I did a major organization of my comics was before we moved to this new house, and things got very jumbled up after the move as I would search through things. I don't have the good comic book room I used to have in the old house, and I've just let it get out of control. But even before we moved, the comics were well organized, roughly, at least a lot of it. But I wasn't sure if I'd put it all in my CLZ app. And now I'm looking at the CLZ app and going, hey, I might want to get rid of a couple thousand comics. How do I remove them from the CLZ app that quickly? It's almost too big of a chore, unless I've got to re-examine the app and try to figure out what's to be done. I heard Comic Crack mentioning how he had erased the entire app and started over, and I assume it was because he had sold a lot of his comics. Okay, next question is from Gore Vidal. 2 questions, and he has a third one that was for Quacking Duck. And I love Gore Vidal, and we've had this weird YouTube type of conversation for a long time now. He says it's been 5 years. I thought it'd been even longer. He says it doesn't seem like I met you that long ago. So we both have both on our own timelines. He says, based on your reading, how much of an impact did the independent publishers from the 70s and early 80s, including the Underground Comics, Heavy Metal Magazine, and Warren Publications, have on modern comic book writers? I think they had a lot of influence on what we now see as indie comics. And it would be foolish to think these indie comics that we see now kind of sprung out of the ground all by themselves, or just sprung out from Marvel and DC Comics. There's that long history, and there's feels to me a big influence there. Like you look at a Jonathan Hickman indie comic like Manhattan Projects or something like that, or even East to West or whatever have you. There's that those unique flavors of those comics that you mentioned seeping throughout all of the world of indie comics, and actually seeping their way back into the world of DC and Marvel Comics at times. The other big influence, I think, is Vertigo Comics that you didn't mention, which came along in it wasn't labeled Vertigo Comics yet, but from the late 80s to sometime in the mid to late 90s, or maybe even beyond. But that aesthetic that we started to associate with Vertigo, I think, has seeped into a lot of the indie comics, and also into a lot of ways that comics in general are done, like the writing for the trade and stuff, in my mind, first came from Vertigo. So yeah, you guys should, if you haven't and you have a lot of time on your hands, go back and look at the old Underground Comics, look at the heavy metal, and all of that, dates also goes back to other, the European comics and the EC comics. There's endless sort of weaving of tapestry threads throughout. And I think a lot of stuff in Underground Comics that we just, as a comic book community, aren't conscious of anymore, have a huge effect on what you see in all kinds of comic books now. And if you look at the Underground Comics, you definitely see a lot of that EC comics. And heavy metal at times was a melding of the European comics and the Underground Comics here and there, at least bits and pieces of it, So that's a great question. I someday would like to do many hours of video on that, I suppose. But in a way, Comic Crack, Terrence, has covered that ground very well. And he has asked another question, Gore Vidal does. One of the conditions of them agreeing for me to submit questions was my lawyers at Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe wanted to ask a question also. And their question, in quotes, is, which was worse, Comicsgate, Electragate, or Sagagate? Please limit your answer to at least an hour. So I'll put as a footnote down below the hour-long answer. Well, someday in the future. uh, in real life, of course, Comicsgate has been the worst, but it's been so dumb, such a dumb thing, an annoying thing for taking up people's mental energy, that I would like to just throw it out and never talk about it again. And I think in Electrogate, he's now we're getting the other gates are just inside jokes. Sagagate is Gore not loving Saga the way everyone else does, and a few other people, I think like Paulo Costa and stuff, have agreed with Gore. And interesting because I think, apropos Gore's first question, Saga is an enormous example of the influence of underground comics, Warren comics, heavy metal type of stuff on the current indie comics. So Electrogate is, I think, a reference to the fact that Bullseye Bob does not love Elektra, or at least I don't know if he was joking or serious. And of course, as a big Daredevil fan, he's supposed to love Elektra. So there you go. I guess I didn't really answer your question, Dewey Chudham and how, but as lawyers, you probably expected that. Celia, who has a great booktube channel and has embraced us comic book people, which is really nice of her, us scruffy comic book people compared to the graceful YouTube people, YouTube booktube people, I think. At least most booktube people, their videos seem so much more composed and effective or efficient than us comic book YouTubers. She asks, can you share a comic book memory from your childhood? And so one memory is of an early Captain America comic book I got where I was really getting into drawing by copying images in the comics. And I created a whole comic book, I believe. It's lost to time, that was inspired by this issue of Captain America. And I made up some other superhero, but I used a lot of things. And I remember spending a really long time imitating a drawing by Sal Buscema of Steve Rogers either putting his arm through a sleeve or maybe pulling his arm out of a sleeve of clothes to get into his costume. And just the joy I got of sitting alone in my room drawing my own comic book inspired by that comic book. And so a similar question came from Seth Kumar, who asks, what are two early comic book memories, a good and a bad? So kind of in a different sort, that was a good memory that I just mentioned from Celia's question, but I remember my family traveling to, I can't remember where we were going, maybe to California. We were going on a long plane ride, which are kind of painful for kids. And I'd still only maybe gotten one or two comics. And finally, my parents allowed me to buy more than one comic at a time at the airport. And I bought what felt to me like a giant stack of comics. It was my first giant stack of comics. And I think it had Conan number 25 in it. And it had I don't know if the time, I can't remember what was in that pile other than the Conan number 25. I want to say an Ant-Man comic, but I don't know if Ant-Man had a solo comic at that time. And a Daredevil comic, I think, with the Man-Bull on the cover, or some other early Daredevil comic I got. And it suddenly turned this tedious 6 or 8 hour or 10 hour voyage into enchanted land for me. I finally got to get a stack of comics, and thank God they had newsstands full of comics in the airport at that time. And Seth also, and a bad memory. A bad memory is twice I got caught trying to steal comics. I felt in my fevered, I think by then maybe 12 or 11-year-old brain, I had to have more comics and I couldn't get them. and I went into a store and I slipped them into my jacket, and of course got caught and was so humiliated, and I felt like like an addict who's led into crime because he can't control himself. And there's one other time when I stole a comic, and I can't remember where that was, but I also got caught. But I can picture the drugstore where I tried to steal the comic and how upset the person I was stealing the comic from was. I think he owned the store. Back then there could be small independent stores, and it was like another person stealing from me. So I felt terrible. And I've never, ever, since those two events, tried to steal anything. And certainly, even at comic book stores or other places like that, or bookstores, if someone charges me too little, somehow thinking back to that and how upset that owner of the store was, I will make sure to tell them, hey, I haven't paid you the fair price yet. And I have let people at with used comics that were mispriced, I've let them take the comic book back if they want. So somehow that experience and the upsetness of the store owner affected me a lot. So that's my bad early comic book memory. Yes, how were comics perceived when you were young? He says we had a flash of popularity followed by a desert of being the nerd before it was cool for myself. I'm not sure where. So something about the way he asked that question implies to me maybe Seth lives in another country, or maybe he just means a different era and a different place. But my parents thought comics would rot your brain. They heard that somewhere and they believed it. And they were that kind of people in general. They were worried about cultural things that would turn you into an imbecile, like rock and roll. So it was a huge battle to get a hold of comics. But on top of that, I had the sense that I couldn't tell anyone about liking comics. So my freshman year of high school, I found one guy who liked comics, but I was only at that school for a year. And I don't know how, it took a long time of being friends with him before we found out that each of us liked comics. In my sophomore year, I was sent off to this boarding school that I hated. And I think I was a bit more open about liking comics there. And I met one guy who liked comics. But in general, I felt like it was a bit dangerous or socially risky to express my interest in comics to anybody. And I totally felt, rightly or wrongly, that girls would look down on you if you read comics, which is part of why I gave up comics when I was 16. Luther Manning and Tiger Fist Comics ask variations of the same question. Luther Patrick says, has YouTube affected the hobby for you? Short and sweet question. And Tiger Fist Comics asks, I would like to know how being part of the YouTube comics community has impacted or changed your collecting and reading habits. And as probably already indicated in some of my other questions, it's had a big effect. And so I could do a long video on all the different effects, but it's a huge source of information, inspiration of different things to collect. Since I came on YouTube, and it sort of focused me on the hunt for back issues more, seeing other people do it. And I dug more around my local shops and looked around more and realized how many comics I could get cheaply. So that comics that I really wanted, because of the way the marketplace works now, a lot of comics are very cheap. And that sort of spurred on the hunting urge. And I let go of my inhibitions that I built up in the past of not getting things that I wanted, and kept discovering more and more things that I wanted. So thus the giant closet full of over 10,000 comics that I don't even know how many there are there. And much more learning about indie comics. When I started on YouTube, I think my pull list was 4, 5, 6 comics a week, mostly Marvel and DC, and now it's probably 12 comics a week, sometimes even more, and it's mostly indies with a smattering of Marvel, and a very small smattering of Marvel and some DC. So that's all due to that, and that I think being part of this community has maintained the addiction to the weekly churn, the serialized comics, rather than switching back to trades again or sort of going back and forth through different phases. Although I have also now become very addicted to getting hardbacks, and it was through a comic book mom, an early comic book YouTuber, that I learned about in-stock trades. I'm sure if I hadn't learned about it from her, I would have eventually learned about it from someone else. And that website has triggered that whole hardback, that flood of hardbacks into my life, because before that I thought I couldn't afford hardbacks. So those are great questions. The comic board has a question that ties into the last of my little list of confessions. He asks, have you ever thought about packing it all in and just not doing videos? And yes, I came right up to the edge of quitting doing YouTube videos 2 or 3 times, probably at least 3 now that I think of it. And now my skin is a lot harder, and so if I stopped now, it wouldn't be for these kinds of reasons, but it was because of different behind the scenes clashes between people, or people saying nasty things about each other. So at the time, like if 2 people, both of whom I considered my YouTube friends, hated each other, it just made me want to stop doing YouTube. Or when I found out a bunch of people hated me, that made me want to stop doing YouTube. But I persevered. I realized I was doing it for myself. As the community's gotten huge, it is less, I still am in conversation with a lot of people, but it's less like there's this small little group that I want to be a part of and be part of the conversation. So it is more now for me a thing I do for myself. I always was, but I mean, I sort of discovered more and more. And so now it's harder to bump me out of it because I'm doing it just as long as it interests me. I have to confess, though, I'm also doing it just as long as I get comments. If I start, getting almost no comments, that would probably whittle down the amount of YouTube videos I do, or maybe change a little bit of what the videos I do, since I still view things as a conversation. So getting comments back does spur me on. But I do have a lot tougher skin now, and I also just kind of avoid certain things that I maybe didn't in the past that would cause me to get depressed about certain people on YouTube or the like. So he asked, if so, what keeps you continuing to make new content? So I guess, like I said, it still is the community that's a large part, and then the other part is that I'm just doing it for myself. Also, how do you keep up? This is still the comic board asking questions. Also, how do you keep up with all the other channels, as you are an active commenter on a number of channels? So for most of my YouTube career, I was at a job where I had 2 to 3 hours, and sometimes even more, of very boring work that I could do while listening to people's YouTube videos. And so the window was reduced or hidden. And then I was writing at a keyboard. And so I'm an inveterate writer, typist. So I would just quickly type in a comment, then get back to work. And I've kind of maintained that, even though it's harder now that I left that job, because there's always other stuff to do at home, and I'm less often watching videos on my computer, and more often watching them on a phone where I'm a very bad typist. But I'm often listening and half watching people's videos while I'm washing dishes or preparing meals or doing other things like that. And I just make the time to leave comments because I'm kind of addicted to that a little bit. And I also, because I care so much about comments, I feel like if I like someone's channel and I have anything to say, I should leave a comment. And sometimes I don't because I'm too busy, or I'm listening in a way such that I can't. But whenever I can, I leave a comment, because hopefully that means they'll want to keep making videos and I want to hear their videos. So if I'm leaving comments on your videos, it's because I want more videos from you. And or you've probably said something interesting that made me want to. And of course, that's a circular thing. If you're saying interesting things, that's why I want to encourage you to keep making more videos. Now, a note to that question about Comic Book Board, about if I ever thought about packing it all in, is Gore Vidal added his own comment saying, "My attorneys at Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe have filed an injunction prohibiting Sleepy Reader 666 from answering the first question in the affirmative." So I may be now being sued by Gore Vidal and his team of lawyers. Hopefully they filed it at the proper court. The last time Dewey filed at a food court at the mall. Okay, so maybe I'm safe after all. Hey, well, you have made it through to the end. I congratulate those of you who have come all the way to the end. And not only will I send you a giant no prize in a giant invisible envelope, but you get to see my final confession. I have been holding out on everybody in the YouTube community by not showing the crown jewels in my collection. Mostly because I couldn't think of a good way to do it and I kept putting it off. I didn't want to be showing off. And maybe to some of you this won't be very exciting stuff, but to me it's the three most exciting things in my collection. As you may know, listening to me over the past year or so, I started collecting original art. And early on, I bought 3 pieces by 2 of my all-time favorite artists. So the first one I have here is a unpublished page of the Dingbats of Danger Street. What would that be, about a 1974, 1973 Jack Kirby. Apparently there are 2 whole unpublished issues of the Dingbats of Danger Street, although I think they have now been published by 2 Morrows just in the past month or so. And I bought these from, I don't know, 6 months ago, 7 months ago. They were part of a Paris auction being done through Heritage Auctions. There was another one that I really wanted, another page, and I missed it by $100, or no, I think like $20. Someone who knew how to do that, the bidding after the bidding is closed, got it out from under me. I was really pissed about that. But happily, I got this one, and I really like it. But that's not all. Going on up, I have a Jack Kirby Commandy page. Now, this is from issue 39. It's either the last or the second to last issue he drew. And the script is actually by Jerry Conway. And Commandy goes underwater and meets giant underwater snails, amongst other things. So it's probably not the most memorable Jack Kirby Commandy, but it is Jack Kirby Commandy. And, I can't be more thrilled over that. One of my most favorite comic books of all time, and original art. And there's something to me that just sizzles, electrically lights up my brain when I look at a piece of paper that Jack Kirby himself worked on, and then Mike Royer worked on it too. This is a Mike Royer one. A lot of the Commandy is Bruce D. Berry, who I don't like quite as much as Mike Royer. So I'm really glad to have a Mike Royer inked piece. And I think actually the Dingbats is also Mike Royer inking. So, but that's not all, folks. A final part of this confession. I'm sorry I've been holding out on everybody. It just happened that way. And again, like I said, I didn't really want to be showing off, but you can't help but feel like you're showing off when you're showing these relatively expensive. These are on the cheaper side way on the cheaper side of the Kirbys that you could get. And this is on the cheaper side of the Will Eisner Spirit that you can get. The Spirit is not on this page. It is Commissioner Dolan and, what's his name? Suddenly I'm having a brain fart. It's not Ebony. It's his replacement, the Eskimo boy. Sammy, I think? Probably says right on here somewhere. Yep, Sammy. It is so beautiful. So incredible. I believe this is from 1950. June 11th, it says. But, oh, here we go. A Spirit, June 11th, 1950. It's just amazing. The quality of it, the workmanship. This is, when people talk about the old comics being twice up and then more recent comics being 1.5 up, there's the difference there. So that's the older, the Golden Age, and the early Silver Age comics. So, yeah, I don't know what else to say, but there is, I confess, both to spending a lot of money, but not as much as you might think, again, because these are minor pages, and keeping these under wraps. A few of my friends who do live in Portland have seen them already, and if you ever visit Portland, I'll show you my original art collection if you like. But for now, it's been a good 8 years, and thank you all for your comments and your views, and your own videos are really important to me, and I wish you adieu.